Armored Core 3 Retrospective. After playing Armored Core 3, I really feel the primitiveness of previous entries, because after seeing the gamification of the mech economy horror story here played straight, looking back, I can't help but feel I was being underserved by the disregard to sincerity in previous entries. Also, this game just plays much better than those older ones. That's not to say that there's nothing to the previous entries. The formula they perfected here clearly needed time to be established, but with Armored Core 3, the framework laid down in the original game is utilized better than I feel it ever was before. This is the logical endpoint of how to make a game by building on top of a mustache-twirling PlayStation 1 mech game from 1997. There's a reason they made serious core gameplay changes in the numbered entries moving forwards, because whatever else you might want this framework to deliver on is almost certainly better achieved by redesigning the game from the ground up. In this sense, I feel like Armored Core 3 is the Kingsfield 4 of its franchise. It's just the first game again, made by a much more seasoned staff, on more powerful hardware, and polished to a mirror sheen. And this actually extends beyond the gameplay because, like the case was in Kingsfield 4, this game takes place in a new continuity. But you know, it's actually just the story of the first game again, but bigger, deeper, and better told. The framework for Armored Core will change in the following titles, but it's really satisfying that before they made those changes, they gave us a showcase of everything the original formula could be in the hands of true masters. Hi, I'm AesirAesthetics, and this is the obligatory suggestion for you to watch the previous 2 videos I made on the Armored Core series before watching further, as I'm building on top of points raised there, and I will be assuming you're familiar with my thoughts on what came before. If you've watched those videos already, or if you're a maniac who's too cool for school and you want to start a series on the 3rd entry, grab yourself a cup of coffee, and let's dive in. Since we're rebooting the series with this title, some story beats should sound familiar. A long time ago, humanity moved to live underground after a cataclysmic event destroyed the surface world, and the subterranean world mankind lives in now is ruled over by an artificial intelligence. There are gigantic corporations who try to obtain power by utilizing the mech mercenary economy to their advantage, and we play as a none-too-wise mech pilot who's thrown in the middle of this insane world, tasked to earn a living the only way we can. Our choices have some sway over where the story goes, but the real kicker is in how making these choices, and others like the mission selections and mech customizations and such, makes us complicit in the mech economy, just like it was in the first 2 numbered titles. The biggest change to the story this time around is probably in how there's some serious philosophical rationales given to the various actors here. I love this change because we now have these ready-made perspectives for us to explore the world through when we're dropped into it, but near the start, as usual, our aim is just to get money. We're redoing the story of the first game, but the changes to the presentation and the little differences are interesting because they radically shake up the dynamics of how the story plays out. For starter, the opening crawl reaffirms that just like in the first game, the world is controlled by a singular AI entity known as the Controller. And right away, that's a very interesting change. These people are not being duped by the AI, they know that it's in charge, and the central thematic conflict of the story actually occurs when the controller begins to malfunction. Every faction has their own reaction to this, and the game asks you to consider the questions this dilemma raises for the world. First of all, is the controller actually malfunctioning, or are the people just misinterpreting it? Are the bad outcomes the result of bad processes, bad interactions, or are the people actually the ones to blame for things going haywire? Is the controller doing the best it can to shepherd humanity? Is it humanity's place to question the controller like this? And if the AI is malfunctioning, into whose hands should the power to lead mankind be placed until the controller has been fixed? Whose hands can we trust to fix it? And if the controller can malfunction, should power ever be put back into its hands? So many interesting questions which crop up simply by making the AI public knowledge in-universe. We navigate these questions by interacting with the game's corporations. They've been expanded upon from what we've seen before, because this time around, they are not in competition purely for market shares and power, they have ideological differences as well. Mirage wants access to the controller in order to manipulate its processes to favor them. Crest believes that the controller should not be messed with, and that, however flawed the current order may be, it's the best humanity can hope for. Kisaragi takes a middle-of-the-road approach, where they only push where there's an obvious advantage. This is because they are the smallest of the three megacorporations and have the most to lose if they ever screw up. You can see how the corporation's positions in the world actually pulls at them and nuts them into taking the sides they take, and you, the player, might actually begin to take sides this time around. In the first game, the only real concern was making money, and the ethical ramifications of our actions were in the toilet from the get-go. I keep harping on about this, but the first mission there was to either eliminate squatters or eliminate strikers. When that's the entry level for moral choices in your game, don't expect players to really invest a lot debating the morality of their actions in the experience to follow. At least not in the moment. They'll reflect on how they're the bad guy, but this sort of narrative is all about exploring the moral nature of the world in which the game takes place. It worked for what the first game and the second one were going for, but here it's a bit different because the game is more interested in exploring the idea of order and the proper function of society in this universe. Like in previous games, there's no gun to our head which forces us to think too hard about it, but the way things are laid out, I found myself no longer reading the emails for flavor text to my progress, but I found myself making progress to get to unlock the next emails. I went on a whole thing in the video on the second game about how the dehumanized and disconnected presentation format of Armored Core, the email screens, the mission select screens, the arena info dumps, might necessarily make for a lack of empathy in the narrative, and I feel that they might not have made Leos Klein land as hard as they could have in that game, because his story was such a personal tale and it was being told in the least personal way possible. There is something cool about the contrast, and you can see how this cold attitude to human interactions might have permeated the entirety of that world and might have been why things could never move away from the mech economy. And maybe the reason no one knows what to make of Leos Klein is because their skills at interacting with other humans was so underdeveloped that everyone just sort of unquestioningly agreed that the only response was mech warfare. This was a cool development, but it felt like it was born from the Armored Core interface and made to commit to that cold tone, because that's the extent to the expressive range of that game. But now, I have Armored Core 3 in the same format manages to actually thread the needle on both being really sincere and personal, and when I saw this, I felt like I needed to let go of the assumptions I was bringing into the game, because I didn't expect Armored Core to be able to pull something like that off without changing the format itself. Something I really like about the Armored Core style is that the conflict doesn't have anything to do with us from the offset. In the first game, this was a great way to distance the player from the factions and let us immerse ourselves in the amoral murder machine which the world had become. In the second game, there's actually a bit of a reversal on this last minute, because the villain there was the hero long ago, and because he was, we can see that the most earnest approach to addressing the conflict in the PlayStation 1 trilogy didn't actually work to stop the conflict, and the insane rebellion Leos Klein led after coming to Mars was recontextualized with him actually having a sense of humanity which the other factions didn't share. You can approve or disapprove of Klein's methods and actions, but he was not in the fight for power because he loved power. And that reversal actually hit surprisingly hard, because the game before that had had such disregard to this brand of earnestness. Here, the earnestness is front-loaded, so the protagonist being uninvested in the conflict from the offset allows us to approach things from a neutral perspective and evaluate the quarrels on their merits. Depending on how much you RP as your character while playing, you might find yourself making excuses for the actions of the factions you latched onto from the start, and if you approach the game like we were instructed to approach the previous ones, you might actually have a really beautiful moment of realization when it clicks that this time around, the organizations in the game are being sincere. An interesting feature in every Armored Core game we've discussed so far is that the Ravens always have a middleman between them and the corporations. In the first game it was the Raven's Nest, in the second game the Nerf's Concord, and now it's the Global Cortex organization. which always makes me think of the Globex Corporation, where Homer worked when they moved to Cypress Creek. The middleman organizations always express a radical neutrality to the corporate wars, which I figure solves for the potential issue of the player's missions being infested with the propaganda of one side or another. So, if we didn't have a middleman, it's not so obvious to me that the Ravens could function as an outer party to the events of the story. Rather, they'd probably need to be folded into the sides they fight for, and that kind of dependence would probably not gel well with the idea of the player getting to explore the world by accepting different missions from different factions who have different ideological leanings. Speaking of, the Globex Corporation was not immune from having its worldview expanded upon. They don't take sides exactly, but our manager, Lane Mayers, shows herself to have a lot of conflicting views about the controller and our actions, so even if you're not interested in questioning your doings and allegiances, those emails are the game's way of still putting those questions in front of you. She does usually take our side, but you have to figure that she's acting on incomplete information, just like we are, and it's not like she has access to an alternate reality where we made different decisions to compare and contrast what we do against. Every problem in this universe is solved by sending a man in a mech to shoot and explode their way through a gauntlet, so the only thing you can really argue over is the outcome of shooting your way through one gauntlet and not the other. It was cool in previous games to dive into the email screens and mission briefs and read between the lines of sanitized corporate speak to get at what was really going on, but I'm actually liking this new setup where the different actors just straight up get to explore their own feelings on the happenings around them. The story is still about the vicious mech economy and the insane world the people live in, but unlike before, we're not made to marinate in the cynical attitude of the license. The story takes us to dark places, and there's a lot of unpleasant attitudes about human societies and such expressed, but it feels like it comes from a tragic place of being defeated, rather than the comparatively edgy place of previous games. Like in the first game, the central AI is not doing a good job of leading humanity, but unlike the first game, we're made to explore the ramifications of shutting it down. In the light of who the most powerful human factions are, who else can really be trusted to guide humanity? There isn't really anybody here who isn't a deeply troubling choice to replace the controller. The presentation of the story is basically the same as in previous games, but the major difference is the tone, which is a lot more somber and serious this time around, and that everything is more or less framed around a central ideological conflict from the get-go. The controller experiencing errors is established right away, and this has spurred the creation of Union, a rebel group who believes that humanity is being led to its destruction and want the AI to be overthrown. Like I said earlier, the corporations, Crest, Mirage, and Kisaragi all have different approaches and ideas about the nature of the controller, but they're also locked into existential wars for survival against the other corporations. In a very FromSoftware fashion, the factions which could replace the existing order are not powerful enough to actually do it by themselves, and since they exist in the paradigm of the current failing order, they are being molded into entities which are naturally corrupt because clean hands can't really exist in a world where mech-operated violence is the currency of the day. You might find yourself agreeing with one of the game's factions, but you'd be hard-pressed to trust them with the power currently held by the controller. The new regime necessarily has to emerge as the victor against the old in its own domain, mech warfare, but being able to out-mech warfare the controller only proves you're able to defeat the current order. It doesn't tell you anything about what would come next. As in previous games, we are made complicit with the horrors by being sucked into the mech customization fantasy and the appeal of doing just one more mission to afford that one mech part you really need to complete your build. Armored Core has always nailed getting us to behave like a money-grubbing little chaos agent in an insane world, but here, the world building was strong enough that before accepting missions, I'd puzzle out exactly what I was going to be doing and whose aspirations I'd be helping before thinking about the paychecks. The game managed to make me care. I cared, guys. It used to be that I just did missions for the money, got the money for the mech parts, and got the mech parts for the missions, and while this still describes the core Armored Core 3 gameplay loop, this time around there's this added layer of appreciation for how deeply realized all the factions I'm interacting with are. There are some new features to toy around with, like the drones and consorts, read allies we can hire to help us out in missions, but outside of facilitating more tactical approaches to enemy encounters, these new features aren't all that consequential to the Armored Core experience. The returning features is really where the meat of the game design and player direction is at. So everything is about the mech economy. After each mission we tally up our expenditures, so ammo used, damage taken, mission objectives achieved or failed, and use whatever funds we can acquire to obtain parts for our mechs in order to improve our odds at success in subsequent missions. They removed my beloved Human Plus failure state and made the easy mode a core part you can equip. Boo. So now if you get into crazy amounts of debt, you're just kinda stuck in crazy debt and can't buy anything new. This is offset by the arena, which is where we throw ourselves at bot-controlled mechs for an easy paycheck. Cutting Human Plus, I think, is the absolute worst thing about this game. For movement, we're still using tank controls, right down to the shoulder buttons being used for strafing and looking up and down, and the face buttons are still being used for interacting with the world and activating weaponry and such. This conceptualization of the mech fantasy, that the mechs are clunky, gigantic machines, is a series mainstay which, at this point, had not been strayed away from. We're still in a world where mechs are not toys. We have clunky feeling tank controls because these are clunky tanks. And the slight input lag and the lack of serious tilting functions, so there's no collision object which corrects for our movement when we slightly, accidentally nuts into a wall or something. The lack of this makes sense because, like I always say in these videos, we aren't playing as the mech, we are playing as the pilot. And the actual struggles of controlling these clunky machines make sense because the gamification is that of actually being a pilot trying to maneuver around in a gigantic clunky killing machine, rather than us being the super powerful mech from anime who does cool turbo spin acrobatics. This is not the only way of doing mech fantasy, but this is how these games have read to me so far, and I quite like it, consciously designed this way or not. The big shakeup this time around can really be put down to tone. The gameplay is mostly the same as before, just more refined, and the structure is as well. The opening of the game is the same opening I've discussed twice already, where we begin by naming our pilot and such, but because they put the legwork in early on to establish that these are sincere characters in an insincere world, and since the ideological framework of the experience is established right away rather than being a last-minute plot twist, even though you're playing the same game you've played many times before, you'll probably interpret the same mechanics differently. Because the game meditates on the wildly destructive nature of the gameplay experience, instinctual to any player who touches the controller and navigates through this framework. Once we've named our character, we're dropped into the middle of a mission which acts as our induction into the Ravens, and after we finish it, we get messaged by both the controller and lane mayors. The controller makes sure we know our place in its society, and Mayors explains that the Ravens act on behalf of Global Cortex. I went over the function of these entities already, but I just want to note that Mayors describes Global Cortex as a commercial enterprise which specializes in dispute resolution. I like that terminology. Very sanitized stuff. The early moments of a game are the most important to get right because the entire experience to come will be evaluated by the standards established early on. And while Armored Core 3 is in many ways a very drab game, there's not a lot of heroes to root for here. I don't think the opening mission is the best opening the game could have had, because it's a very unexceptional mission in the game I consider to have the best missions in the series so far. Half of that is the interesting scenario direction and map layouts and such, but the other half I think can really just be put down to how much trash they've pruned from the missions and how they lean into the best these mechanics can deliver on. We still haven't transitioned into full analog stick controls, so a lot of the old pains are back. They do work to highlight the whole you are the pilot, not the mech sensibility of the game, but whatever clunkiness would be lost by transitioning into analog sticks at this point could surely be made up by how many face buttons would be freed up to handle more exciting functions. Some of the optional parts in this game are quite fun to tinker with because they are often very niche and clutch, things like small jet boosts when you press the R2 button or something like that, but because those buttons are also being used for looking around, I feel like we've finally reached the point where the limited controller real estate is impeding on the gameplay, and buttons having to double up on functions is going to land differently for different people. Maybe you enjoy more options coming with less intuitiveness, maybe you don't. For me, I can say that the loss of precision aiming never felt worth any of the clutch maneuvers these parts gave me, so that aspect of the game went completely underutilized when I was playing. Maybe some of the Armored Core gods disagree and find that there isn't much of a trade-off in precision with these, but regardless, this is not the most snappy and intuitive way these games could be playing, and I'm confident that the sentiment of the mech fantasy could be preserved even if we assigned movement to the analog sticks. And I'm pretty sure that the devs actually agreed because, like I said, there's a noticeable effort to prune the missions. The worst parts of previous games are not really revisited in this one. At least I can't say I found myself combating a lot of jets at any point, and this kind of feels like an admission from the developers about the primitiveness of their gameplay. Armored Core 3 has a much stronger grasp of what this game's format is good at, and it just goes all in on that to the exclusion of everything else. I'm a big fan of the half-sunken ship we need to recover cargo from, only to have to dramatically escape the thing once we've reached the bottom of it because it starts to sink. I'm especially a fan of how they offer us a higher paycheck if we destroy some of the cargo about, and how this eats into our ammo and can really entice us to take detours when we're escaping the sinking ship. This is such a slam dunk mission with such a straightforward gimmick for player direction. There's another great mission where we're eliminating 5 turrets and it takes place in a foggy forested swamp, so you don't quite see ahead, and this is a good showcase of that thing I always talk about where a good challenge is often just a question of removing some aspect of the game which the player has come to rely on. In the case of this turret mission, it's long-range visibility. You can fly above the trees to get a better idea of what's going on, but that makes you an easy target, so we have a sort of stealth mission where we're piloting a gigantic mech through a forest, which is really cool. I'm also a fan of the mission where we need to disable a laser by flying into it while it's firing at us in a very cramped hallway, full of those time-sensitive shields from the Phantom Menace, turrets, and little pockets to dip in and out of for safety. If you have the right setup, you can destroy the laser from way far back, but if you don't, get ready for a mission which demands excellence from you, because the damage dealt here is not a joke. The missions are really well designed in this game, and more so than ever before, I'm really feeling that the distinct voices of the separate parts of the game world are coming through in the missions themselves. The game takes place in a subterranean world, like in Armored Core 1, but the Layered, the name of the city here, is much more interesting than Isaac City was, I feel, partly because it is actually layered. So it's a bunch of differently themed areas stacked around and on top of one another. They have different functions, and you could imagine an AI coming to the conclusion that this sort of segmenting of society might be a good idea, if only because it makes monitoring and commanding the populace easier. There's a whole society is being designed around the convenience of the governing body rather than the other way around. Conversation to be had here, and because the world is laid out like this, you can get an understanding of the organizations just by looking at the locations they like to operate in. Most missions in the game come from Crest, who are all about not undermining the controller's rule, and their missions include End Employee Standoff, where we're asked to destroy the laid-off employees who've taken over the soon-to-be demolished Zidane weapon factory, as a form of protest for having been laid off. This mission is familiar to Armored Core alumni, but we're muddying up the waters a bit with the presentation here because it's made clear that the area redevelopment from previous games is actually intended to create new housing here. And yes, we are once again being asked to destroy strikers who are protesting being laid off, but that this was a weapons facility expands a bit on the narrative from the first game, because the squatters we're destroying are doing the same thing we're doing in perpetuating the mech economy for their own self-interest. They are trying to keep a weapons facility running because otherwise they'd be out of a job. We are going in there to fight them because otherwise we'd be out of a job. Crest also has missions like Safeguard Alloy Sample, Eliminate Intruders, Prevent Capsule Theft, etc., which all highlight how many resources are being squandered by the factions trying to sabotage one another. Another mission of theirs, which highlights their ideological leanings in the controller is malfunctioning narrative, is Steal the Access Program. Mirage is plotting to take over the controller, and this mission is Crest's Hail Mary attempt to stop them. Mirage originated as an industrial machine manufacturer and are the biggest corporation in the world, and what do you know, their missions show them to be mostly active in the third layer, the industrial research area, which makes sense because they're all about advancing their interests and their control over the world's resources. And you see that coming through in their missions, like Investigate Magma Ruins, where we're sent along with the Raven Huntress to look for a secret entrance to the controller. Mid-mission, she reveals that she's actually a ride-or-die controller fangirl, and then teams up with the ambushing Fanfare Raven to try to destroy us. I really like the mission brief we get for this one. Disruptions caused by the controller forces are on the rise. If they continue, we may have no choice but to launch an attack on the controller itself. See, we're not even power hungry, man. We just have to do this, because otherwise the disruptions will continue. We'll have no choice but to attack the controller. What other options exist? The world building and the player direction in this game is really strong. Another great Mirage mission is Assault Crest Facility, and it's a great Mirage mission because we don't actually get it from Mirage, we get it from Union, the terrorist group who believe the controller is leading humanity to its death and are hellbent on destroying it first. Union and Mirage have teamed up here, but since Mirage wants to keep its dubious activities hidden, they actually withdraw their forces when the assault begins. Which is wonderful characterization via gameplay for a gigantic faceless megacorporation. Kisaragi being the smallest of the corporate giants means they can't really take on the other two directly, so their missions are things like Destroy Nair Bridge, where they ask us to sneakily sabotage a bridge built by Mirage, which was getting them a lot of good publicity. The mission brief ends with them asking us to incorporate civilian casualties and a promise of extra pay if we destroy the monorail which is using the bridge. So far, I think Armored Core 3 presents the most interesting and fleshed out world out of any of these games. In video games, a lot of the identity of the protagonist is built up by the cumulative post hoc rationalizations the player makes to have the decisions they make congeal to a coherent worldview or character. For myself, I actually think this is more often the case than the forwards projecting style of roleplay, where I center my character within a specific ethos and then try to make choices that character would make. One of the benefits of the less stringent post hoc approach is that the characterization is a lot more open-ended, and the ethic of the world around the player can better express itself because there's never a time where the story grinds against the doctrine morality which the player imported into the game. Armored Core is not exactly a role-playing series in the sense of multiple branching story points and dialogue and encounter confrontation options, but out of the original trilogy, the world design here comes the closest to offering that up, and like I said earlier, on the player side, I was feeling myself being pulled into meditating on my choices more than I did in the previous games because I felt the world was internally realized enough that it would reward this sort of approach. It doesn't turn out to be Planescape Torment or anything remotely like that, but the changes to the world design trickle down to how the player approaches the world in some interesting ways. I went on a whole thing in the video about how the dehumanized presentation format might necessarily make for a lack of empathy in the narrative, and how I felt that in Armored Core 2 they might not have made Leos Klein land as well as he could have, because his story was such a personal tale, being told in the least personal way possible. But then I noted that the same presentation format from there was actually sort of threading the needle this time around on both being really sincere and personal, and I want to talk a bit about this. I think the changes which facilitated this new tone landing with the old presentation format are, firstly, the game never breaks face. It's sincere all the way through. You don't start the game as a gun-happy maniac plowing down strikers for money. They put some work in to contextualize the standoff as being more complicated. See the employee standoff mission I described earlier. The whole "you are actually the bad guy" narrative from the first game gets exported onto everyone in the Armored Core 3 universe, and they don't shy away from the ramifications of this new addition to the world building, which is one reason why I think the old dehumanized presentation format actually lands some emotional blows this time around, because you can't help but feel the people of this world are doomed to never escape the cycle of violence. The second way I think the dehumanized presentation format manages to land some emotional blows here is that the characterization is focused on the central conflict of the world, that being the controller malfunctioning, and that everyone's actions and beliefs are being rationalized around this. So, because we never really stray that far away from this problem and we keep interacting with different groups, we get a very complete picture of where everyone stands compared to everyone else, and it makes every faction feel a lot more distinct than they did in the past when they all mostly just wanted power and money. You might not trust any of the factions to actually be given the power of the controller after it's been shut down, but you can still see where everyone is coming from. Mirage wants to use the power for their own end. Crest doesn't want the controller to be shut down at all. So you can argue that out of these two factions, Crest is the preferred option because they aren't motivated solely by the amoral pursuit of power, but it might actually be the other way around. Mirage wanting the power might make them the better pick. Give it to Crest who don't want it, and it'll fall out of their hands, and underneath Crest we'll get yet another corporate mech war where everyone is embroiled in bloody warfare to try and eat up the power which is leaking out of the unprepared Crest Corporation. Give it to Mirage and they might actually use it to shut the corporate war down, if only because the war loses them profits. There's a lot of different ways to interpret the conflict of the game, and a lot of different ways the game could close out. And the path they take, which leads directly into Armored Core Silent Line, is actually very devious. After we shut down the controller, the surface world is opened up to us and we learn that the controller was designed to break down, that over time the scars of war should have healed and humanity was meant to pick up the slack where the controller was wrong and take charge of their own lives. But that didn't really happen. The surface world is opened up to mankind, but the mech economy is still chugging along, and the dreams of the founders of the Layered are left in the dust as mankind goes back to the surface with no lessons having been learned. The sequel to Armored Core 3 is Silent Line, and the ramifications of mankind freed from the subterranean world are explored in depth there. I might one day dedicate some videos to exploring the spin-offs to the older Armored Core games, but the gameplay changes aren't all that significant, so it would mostly just be me going over the story there. I don't know if you guys really want that, and personally I'm more interested in the directorial techniques of the games than I am in the overarching narrative. So even though I might someday make some videos for the early gen spin-off games, for now, stay tuned for the Armored Core 4 retrospective. But don't click away from this video just yet. The long-awaited Grass vs Estes healing video I made way back will remain a Patreon exclusive for a bit longer while I release the rest of the Armored Core videos. Gotta strike while the iron is hot, you know. If you're interested in checking out the Grass vs Estes video, or you just want early access to the Armored Core videos, be sure to hit up the channel Patreon over at patreon.com/medievalmegaman. Videos like this one can take a lot of time to assemble, and any support you can give is massively appreciated. Also, let me know if you would be interested in some videos on those spin-off Armored Cores. The link to the Patreon is in the video description. Fuel the mech game hyperfixation for as little as $1. Let me know what you think about Armored Core 3, and be sure to subscribe if you want these videos readily available on your feed. On another note, check out my game. It's expanded somewhat since I last updated you guys on it, and I hesitate to give any more information related to release dates, but I've managed to rewrite the entire story to fit the altered map layout, and I've added some new interesting areas. At least I think they're interesting. After I've made all of the necessary Armored Core videos, I'm going to spend some time making a completely playable version of it, and then it's just a question of polishing it to a mere machine. If you want some sporadic updates on the game, check out the Discord link in the description. Also, if you don't care about the game, you should still check out the Discord link because we all have a lot of fun on the Friends of Aesir Discord channel. And that's a much better optimized interface for long-form discussions about the games we cover in the videos anyways. So yeah, long-winded outro. I'm AesirAesthetics. See you in the next video.